everyone, it's Brandy here. We're back again for our weekly YouTube video, and this week we're going to work on these shutter door chest. I picked these up at a local estate sale. I'm going to start out by cleaning them. I removed the hardware, and these cleaned up to be bleeders, so I added a coat of Dixie Belle Boss Stain and Odor Blocking Primer in gray.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lay my base coat of paint on this. Now, because my concept for these is a really farmhouse look, I'm going to use Dixie Belle Crackle. This is the crackle medium that we'll put on later. But what I want to get on is going to be my undercoat that will show through my crackle. So what you're going to see, the paint that's getting put on here, is not going to be anything that you see on our finished look. It's just going to peek through a little tiny bit. When I originally did these live, I used yellows, but what I found was that when I tested it with the crackle, the color that I want to use as my main body color, which is a white, the yellow wasn't enough contrast. So I know that you need contrast with crackle, but I thought the yellow would be enough, and it just wasn't. It didn't show at all. And so I'm going over these and I'm redoing them with just my 3 shades of blue. The 3 shades of blue that I'm going to use are going to be the Gulf, Dusty Blue, and Stormy Seas. And those are going to go underneath drop cloth with the crackle medium. So right now I'm just going to lay on my layer of the Dusty Blue, Stormy Seas, and the Gulf. I'm just going to use one brush. I'm sharing it in between all my colors, and I'm basically going to do just a really quick blend over these. Initially, this would probably be, if I was doing a blended look, this would just be my rough draft blend, but I'm going to leave it like this, and it's just going to show through underneath my final color in my crackle medium. These are going to be the colors that you see in the cracks. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I don't even care about brush strokes in this coat because the crackle is going to add texture. I do need to pull out these drawers and I'll get all inside the frame and everything. So this is the Gulf. Now I'm going to come back with my same brush and I'm going to start laying on some of my Dusty Blue. And I'm just going to use water and I'm going to brush these two colors right into each other. I'm roughly cutting my piece into thirds. So a third for the Gulf, a third for my Dusty Blue, and a third at the bottom for Stormy Seas. Okay, now that I've got my basic paint layout dried on here, I let this dry for a few hours and I'm coming back. I'm going to lay on my crackle medium. So crackle medium from Dixie Belle is almost like a gel. So let me show you the thickness of it. If I pick it up with my brush, you can see it dripping off like a gel. It's very thick. This is not like laying on a clear coat. It's not supposed to be. When you're laying on crackle, you want to make sure that you're using a chip brush. You don't want to use your nice brushes for this. It's like a glue, basically. It's like a glue. It's like painting with glue. And you don't want to rinse this down your drain. So I just use a chip brush and then I'm just going to discard this when I'm done. So how you brush on your crackle will determine what type of cracks you get. And you can play with your brush strokes to figure out what kind of crackle you're going to get. I recommend, if you've never done this before, start with a sample board, an old cabinet door or something, and brush it on and play with the different types of crack you can get. So basically you brush on your base coat like you would normally brush on any type of base coat. And then you're going to come back with your crackle medium and you can brush this on any which way you want. Okay, so I'm going to brush this on horizontally across my slats. Where you put your crackle medium on thicker, you're going to get thicker, fatter cracks in your next layer of paint. So I'm going to kind of make my crackle a little thicker over here in the corners where it would naturally kind of wear a little bit more on a pair of shutter doors. So I'm going to go ahead and fill my brush up. I'll start in the corner and I'm going to pull it all the way across. And I'm going to do that all the way down the front of these. Start in my corner, so that's the thickest part, and pull it all the way across. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Thicker in the corner and pull it across. That way I have a little bit of crackle across all of the front, but it's thicker in the corners. Okay, I want to make sure I spread it out as evenly as possible so I have crackle a little bit everywhere. This is, like I said, this is not like brushing on a clear coat though, so it's not going to brush on evenly like a clear coat does. It's thick. It's a gel. It is very much like painting in Elmer's glue. And I'm going to go across the front of all of my doors. You can do a cross-hatching pattern. If you do cross-hatching, which is a vertical and a horizontal, you will get thicker, kind of almost circular cracks. And so I'll mix some of those in the corners. I don't want to miss anywhere. I can see there's a light sheen on it. It almost adds a little bit of gloss to my furniture piece, and that helps me tell where I've got my crackle and where I don't. So I do want to make sure I get fairly even coverage on it. A little bit of my crackle everywhere. I don't need to worry about brush strokes. This is going to be a textured finish. It's going to add texture to my furniture piece, so that's okay. Same thing with across the drawer. I'm going to start on the edges, so I get my thickest cracks over there, and then I'm going to thin it out going all the way across. So I've got crackle going all the way across, but the thickest portion is going to be around the edges of my drawers. Okay, once that's done, let's go ahead and do the other side as well. Once I've got my entire doors covered in my crackle medium, I'm going to let this dry overnight. It needs to be fully dry before I can come back and put my next coat over the top of it. So I'll go ahead and let this dry overnight on these pieces, and when I come back tomorrow, it will be ready to put on my main body color, and that's going to be the color that you see that's dominant over the top, and then you'll see these little peaks of blue coming through from underneath.
My crackle's all applied over both of my pieces. Here is a real-time view up close of what it looks like. I'm going to go ahead and let this dry, and we'll come back and put our coat of paint over the top.
Okay, let's talk about brushing on our next layer of paint, which is going to be Dixie Belle drop cloth over my crackle. When you are brushing on your paint over crackle, you want to make sure you only brush in one direction only. So I'm using a damp brush, my Dixie Belle Mini, and I'm going to start in the corners and pull my paint out on these shutter doors. I'm going to let my paint be nice and thick in the corners, and that's going to give me those nice thick cracks just in the corners of these shutters. When I'm coming from the other side, I'm going to pull the other direction. I'm still only going one way on each shutter. And I'm going to let my paint get a little spotty in the middle, and that's going to help complement those cracks too. Just letting that blue show through in some spots. It's just picking up the texture of the wood grain. I refill my brush a lot. And there my shutter doors are done, and I did not brush back and forth over each other. Another way to resist the urge to brush over yourself when you're wiping on a paint over crackle is I will use our blue applicator sponge. This is the Gator Hide applicator sponge from Dixie Belle, and I've got it nice and damp. And then I'm going to dip it straight into my paint, and I load it up really heavily because I like my paint to be nice and thick, so I get those thick cracks. And then I can wipe it on, always going in one direction. And this helps me resist the urge to brush back over myself by wiping my paint on with the applicator sponge. Always going in one direction. In this case, I'm wiping from left to right, and I don't wipe back over myself. So with crackle, you're not going to be able to get 2 coats of paint on. If you do 2 coats, you're going to paint right back over your cracks in your paint. And so I'm only going to get one coat of coverage on this. So I want to try to make sure that my coat or my coverage is pretty good with my first coat, so I get it on nice and thick with that sponge. I did end up using about half a container of my 8-ounce crackle on these two. These are two pretty large side tables, about the size of one regular size dresser when they're combined. All right, and right away, I'm starting to get cracks in my paint. Can you see the cracks? That's happening right away. So I'm going to let this dry. I'm going to finish up on the front, and I'll let this dry, and we'll come back and see what these cracks look like on these two pieces. You can also see some of my cracks happening right here on another door that I just did. The next thing we're going to be working on is we're going to put some of the Dixie Belle decoupage paper onto the inside doors of this cabinet. I went ahead and coated the interior. This is one coat of Dixie Belle silk, and the color is called Serenity. And I love that this covered in one coat. I chose the silk line because it meant that I didn't need to prime this for bleed through. I was able to just paint or clean my surface well and paint right onto the inside. So let's go ahead and do this door together. I'm going to be using my Dixie Belle Satin Clear Coat is going to be my adhesive in this case. So I've got my Satin Clear Coat out. I've got a brush. I've got a razor knife and a ruler. Now I went ahead and trimmed around the edges of my decoupage paper. It does come with a line of print around the edges, so I just trimmed all my edges on my decoupage paper. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to dry fit. These have a pattern repeat on them, and I want to make sure that I lay this out correctly on my door so that I can line the pattern up and it repeats on itself. Okay, so that's where my seam is going to go. So I'm going to go ahead and put this piece on the bottom. This is the scrap from my last door, and I'm just going to keep a running seam. All right, so that's about where it's going to go. I'm going to have a seam right about in the middle, and then I'll place my next piece on top of it. So I'm going to take my Satin Clear Coat and I'm going to brush it on pretty heavily. The only place I don't brush it onto is over here along the edge, because I know that I'm going to need to trim that, so that I don't want it to attach just yet. I'll go ahead and fill that in once I'm ready to put my paper down. So with my Satin Clear Coat on, I can come with my paper, and I'm just going to go ahead and fit it right into this corner. I did paint underneath my paper in Dixie Belle drop cloth, and that's because this paper is semi-translucent, and that way with the white background you won't see through my paper. Alright, I've laid my paper, and now I'm going to come back with my razor knife, and I'm just going to trim this edge right here. I didn't get it wet because once it's wet with my clear coat, it's harder to trim. It makes the paper kind of soft and it wants to tear. So I leave this nice and dry, come back and trim it. I pull off this scrap here, and that is my piece fit to my door. I also have these ridges in my door itself. I'm going to come back with my razor knife, and I'm just going to cut those into my paper. I just ride my razor knife right into those edges. Okay, and now I'm ready to fully attach my paper. I've got all my cuts made. I'm going to go ahead and attach it. Whoops, got a little bit too much clear coat on there. That's okay. And then I can go ahead and lay my paper right into there. Now I'm going to take my Satin Clear Coat and I'm going to brush it over the top as well. This is my first coat of clear coat over the top. I will probably end up letting this dry and coming back and doing another one when I seal my entire piece as well. This makes sure that my clear coat is coming through my paper from the bottom and also from the top. It's going to encapsulate that paper, and it really makes it a permanent part of my furniture piece. I'm also using my brush to push this paper right into that ridge right there where I sliced it. And I'm not being gentle with my brush either. I'm pushing this paper down so it has no bubbles, no anything, but this paper lays really, really easily. All right, that's a really clean application. Now let's come up here and do this piece. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm not going to put my clear coat up to the very edge, and I'm not going to put it over here where I plan to trim my paper. I'm just going to put it on all the other parts. I'll make my cuts, and then I'll come back and seat those portions of my paper. All right, this is going to have a seam right here. So I need to make sure when I'm laying this that I match my seam up. paper also seams really, really nicely. I'm going to run my seam all the way across, making sure my pattern matches up everywhere. And once it does, then I can go ahead and seat my paper into that clear coat that I've got on there. Come back and make my cuts. First my side cut, and then I'm going to come up here. I'm just going to use my fingernails and kind of score the paper. You want to make sure you have a nice sharp razor blade on your razor knife when you're doing this. It makes it much easier to cut your paper. Got that, and then let me go ahead and cut this again. See if I can get it from this edge. There we go. All right. So my seam looks really clean right there. Now I'm going to go ahead and make those slices in my paper along the edges of these. Alright, and let's go ahead and put my adhesive where I have it laid it along the edges. And then I'll just seat my paper into that clear coat. And same thing with up at the top. It's okay if it gets on the back of the paper as well. That actually will help it adhere. All right, and now I'm going to come back and I'm going to brush my clear coat right over the top. Using my brush to push my paper into these cuts that I made. I also want to mention that I've got some spots right here and here that I came back and I added a little bit of blue paint. Those are areas that did not crackle as well as I would have liked. And so I just added some fresh paint, and I'm going to come back and I put some crackle over the top, and I'm going to come back and add my drop cloth over the top of those. So if you don't like any areas of your crackle, you can just come back, add a little bit of fresh paint, and re-crackle those areas.
Let's go ahead and pay attention to the tops on these. The tops I sanded down using my Surf Prep sander. I started with an 80 grit sandpaper, then 120, and then 220. That got me down to the bare wood on these. And now I'm going to streak in Dixie Belle Voodoo Gel Stain in the colors of Up in Smoke and Tobacco Road. I just use the applicator bottles and I squeeze them on in alternating lines, and then I'm going to brush it together using my Dixie Belle Oval Medium. This creates a random wood tone pattern in the wood that's going to give it a sort of barn wood feel. Make sure my edges are covered and give the stain a little bit of chance to soak into the wood, and then I'm going to come back with a rag and I'm going to wipe this stain back. The theme of these pieces is a sort of farmhouse feel with the crackle, and I think this alternating wood stain really picks up on that look too. None of my pieces would ever be complete without adding some wax detailing. I'm using my small artist brushes, and I'm just going to add some Dixie Belle Grunge Gray wax. I'm starting in the corners of my shutter doors, and then I'm going to sort of smudge it out and then come back with a rag and buff that wax away. After buffing, it's just going to leave a little haze of gray in the corners of these doors, which makes it look really authentically aged. I also came back and sanded my wax in some spots, and this just exposed the drop cloth paint underneath for a little more contrast in those areas. The hardware on these pieces needed a little attention. They were just really tiny knobs that weren't much to look at, so I cast these back plates using amazing casting resin and a silicone mold. I spray painted them black, and now I'm coming back with a little bit of my drop cloth paint and just dry brushing over the top to pick up those details. I am really loving these new silkscreen stencils from Dixie Belle. I find that I'm using them on most every piece. I love just the little bit of detail they can add. So on this piece, I'm going to go ahead and add them to my drawer sides. I also painted my drawer sides in Dixie Belle Silk, and the color is called Serenity. It's this beautiful, sweet farmhouse blue. And then I'm just going to use a little bit of Rebel Yellow. I'm going to scrape over the top of my silk screen stencil, and it's going to leave this beautiful vine design. This vine is a piece of the butterfly silk screen stencil. The reason I chose the blue and yellow details that you'll notice I tied into the paper that's also inside the doors is because I did another piece for this customer that was also done in shades of blue and yellow, and this will subtly tie into those colors that are also going to be in her home. I did just lightly sand over my crackle once it was nice and dry, and then came back and added clear coat over the top of all of these, and they're beautifully done. I'm super pleased with these. I'm not a big crackle user, but I'm really impressed with this look. It's really fun and interesting to look at. I kept the colors on the body and in my staging very simple, so it really pulls in that farmhouse feel. As always, you can find all of the products that I used in the description for this post. There's a full materials list. If you guys enjoyed this video, I hope you'll click that subscribe button, and you can find more Brush by Brandy on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube, and on my website at brushbybrandy.com.